And I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Keith.
All right, thanks, Angela. Thanks everyone for being here. I was afraid I was just going to be talking to Angela today, who probably heard me talk more than enough about my practice. So as Angela mentioned, I'm a social and spatial practice artist. A lot of my work deals specifically with environmental, technological, and social issues, intersection of those issues. I've already so I'll skip over that. I like to give a little brief kind of background on what I mean, or definition of what I mean by these terms. So as a socially engaged practitioner, I do work that is collaborative, often participatory, and involves working directly with communities and people that are impacted by these social environmental issues to do co-creative works of art and design. And as an environmental artist, I'm really engaged in a range of practices, working in a range of mediums that consider the historic and emerging ideas of nature within ecological and politically motivated spheres. So I'm going to go through some of my projects that have led up to the current work that I'm doing at Integral Molecular as the BioArtist in residence. So the first project I'm going to show goes back to my graduate thesis work at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, where I was doing this project called Cryosphere, looking at the kind of field of climate science in this time of recognized anthropogenic climate change. And some of the things that I was interested in here with this project was the challenges of conducting climate science research within a political landscape where there's an excess of climate denial, especially regarding the human role or the anthropogenic role in climate change. Also, within the context of a warming world, when the subject that you're actually studying, like in this picture, is ice from glaciers, which is in the process of melting. So the very kind of subject matter that you're trying to engage with is constantly changing, and it's changing at a really rapid pace. And when the technologies that we're dependent on to conduct that research are themselves also implicated in climate change processes. So one of the things that I did is actually went out to the National Science Foundation Ice Core facility in Colorado, which is part of this really large National Science Foundation facility with geological specimens from all over the world that are used in climate science. But one special place within this building is this freezer, right? And it's a highly controlled freezer that's just filled with ice cores from glaciers up in Greenland, glaciers in the Swiss Alps, glaciers in the Andes, glaciers in the South Pole. And these are unfortunately kind of antiquated refrigeration technologies and systems. The very refrigerants that are being used in the compressors are ones that have been implicated in greenhouse gas, or the greenhouse effect, climate change, and they're extremely vulnerable, right? So the very kind of subject and objects that you're trying to protect and preserve for climate science are also inherently at risk if there's, say, a power outage, or you can no longer get the refrigerant for the compressors, or if the compressors fail. The technology itself, like I mentioned, is really outdated. So even the knowledge of how to maintain these systems, if it's not passed on, right? So there's all these kind of inherent vulnerabilities. So in order to kind of address this complex set of relationships, I wanted to put it into a space where people can actually engage with that material and to begin to think about how ice is being used as an index to measure climate change and to measure human environmental impact on the planet and on our climate. And so these ice cores, one was very generously given to me by the scientists. This particular ice core represents a segment in time that roughly corresponds to the Little Ice Age, which occurred in the 19th century, which itself also kind of roughly corresponds to the period of the Industrial Revolution and the acceleration of anthropogenic climate change. Some people argue that that's kind of when the Anthropocene started, and we could actually start measuring human impact within geological records. So I actually took it out of that refrigerated space and put it within the context of my thesis exhibition and allowed it to melt while I read back some interviews that I conducted with climate scientists over the course of my thesis research period. So also within that exhibition were artifacts from climate science research, including things like the box that this thing was actually shipped in, the freezer that I had kept the specimen in leading up to my exhibition, all of the ice packs that were packed into the box to maintain the necessary temperature for the ice core's preservation, as a way to kind of deconstruct, one, that narrative about climate science, but two, to also put into play that there's this whole infrastructure that exists, right? There's this whole supply chain, cold chain, distribution, infrastructure that is also all implicated in climate change processes, right? Because the airplanes that get the ice core samples from Antarctica to Colorado rely on jet fuel. The trucks that transport these, the refrigerated trucks that transport these specimens all over the country rely on diesel fuel, right? So all of it is simultaneously implicated, even though it's also trying to address and provide us with concrete data that we can act on to do something about climate change. So that kind of launched a series of projects, one of which is not featured here, that all kind of centered on the relationship between ice, a warming world, ice as an index, ice as an aspect of culture, right? Like living in northern climates, we experience the kind of temporal phenomenon of cold weather, or wintry weather. Ice is a resource historically and contemporarily, and ice is a technology. So this second project, Cold Chain, was commissioned by the Cambridge Arts Council for an exhibition called Untold Possibilities, which was a whole kind of survey of artists within the New England area that were doing work on climate change. And interestingly, a piece of Cambridge history that I was really enamored with, and it actually kind of kickstarted my thesis research, was this whole history of ice harvesting that was really the foundation upon which all modern day refrigeration and cold chain technologies are based. So starting in around the middle of the 19th century, again, corresponding with the Industrial Revolution and the Little Ice Age, there were several decades of extremely cold weather, during which all of the freshwater bodies, all the bodies of freshwater of the lakes and the kettle ponds and stuff in the New England region reliably froze to thicknesses, one that you could ice skate on or whatever, have these kind of recreational opportunities. But some industrious people actually figured out that you could cut the ice up into blocks and harvest it and store it in these insulated buildings, and then actually put it on rail cars and use it as a form of refrigerant to ship things like milk, and other produce, things that were perishable, which really opened up not only the kind of possibility of a cold chain and refrigeration infrastructure, but also initiated the first national and then international supply chains for moving perishable goods around the world. So this ice was being shipped as far away as India, down to the Caribbean, to the southern part of the United States, and to Europe. And so there's this kind of anomalous place up in Bristol, Maine that still maintains this tradition of ice harvesting. in recognition of the kind of culture and heritage of the New England region and the relationship that they have to the kettle ponds. And I contacted them because I was really interested in, well, you know, what do you do with this ice beyond just storing it in the insulated ice house and then repeating this kind of annual festival or tradition every year? And they said, well, actually, interestingly enough, a lot of the local fishermen come and take the ice that we harvest and they still use it as a natural form of refrigerant. Hunters come and take it so that when they go out and they are field dressing their game, they can actually put the game into a refrigerated back of their truck or even like right on top of the block of ice. And I was like, well, I'd be really interested in taking some of this ice out of this context and putting it into the context of an urban place that has this heritage, but which is disconnected from it, and kind of use it as a way to sew the thread between all of these issues of the effects of climate change, the fact that the kettle pond, which was a reliable source of ice within the Cambridge region, which was fresh pond, no longer freezes over, right? So this phenomenon no longer even exists. So again, they were like, fine, come load up a truck with as much space as you can carry and do with it whatever you want. So I went in the middle of summer, the ice inside the ice house, because it's insulated, because it maintains the thermal mass from all the ice that's stored in there. It stays completely frozen in its original form all year long. I loaded it up into a truck, I drove it down to Cambridge, and I installed it as an installation. Which we had no idea how long it was going to last in the middle of the summer, but it was a fun little experiment nonetheless, and it certainly got some reactions because where does ice that has this kind of natural looking texture come from in the middle of summer? And so I was able to you know, have some signage and some communication on site that actually was able to connect again this cultural heritage to the story about the evolution of refrigeration and cold chain technologies and to present day effects of global warming. So I think it lasted all of 3 days, which was quite fascinating. It was actually really quite beautiful to watch, even as haunting as it was. The other thing that I discovered in this process was that as the climate is warming and these fresh bodies of water like the kettle ponds in the New England region are no longer freezing over and are staying warmer through the summer months and then into the winter, it's also causing an increase in algae blooms, and which is changing the pH and chemistry of these ponds, which is subsequently affecting the ecology of those ponds. And a lot of the freshwater fish species are dying off in very large numbers. So not only has the advancement in refrigeration technologies changed the culture of the New England region, the effects of modern day refrigeration technologies and their implication in climate change is also now changing the ecology and the chemistry of these fresh bodies of water. So again, it's a local issue with a major kind of global connection. And that's another kind of thread in my work, is looking at local issues through the lens of these global social, environmental, and technological issues. So kind of concurrent to both my thesis work and the other work that I was doing shortly after graduating was a collaboration with a friend and colleague of mine, Matt Battles, who is a writer and co-director of the Meta Lab at Harvard, which I was affiliated with, still kind of am, where we started looking at anthropogenic changes in ecology and landscape. This is another common thread in my work. And we started doing some research and writing together to try and better understand and frame some of these questions around, what is a species, what is a landscape, what is an ecosystem, what is natural, what is non-natural, what's invasive, right? Some of these bigger kind of theoretical, maybe even philosophical questions. And we did that research as part of a project, which I'm not actually going to show anything from the project, but I want to show some of the kind of theoretical musings that we've had as a way to frame the current work that I'm doing at Integral Molecular. So first, I just want to say, or read a quote from Silent Spring, which is this, probably know it very well, the canonical text of the environmental movement. But Rachel Carson wrote, "Seldom if ever has nature operated in a closed and in separate compartments," right? Nature is not this fixed thing that's siloed out into these really discrete things. It doesn't behave by human, it doesn't follow human geopolitical orders. But strangely and historically, that has been kind of the vision of nature, that it's this thing that can be kind of discreetly controlled, siloed, operated on in a very kind of surgical and precise way. Even many of the definitions of nature that you encounter just in like a simple kind of like web search, put nature into a bucket that's separate from humans, right? There's always this kind of division and dividing up and bordering of nature in these very particular and problematic ways. And Rachel Carson was writing about that as she was discussing and researching the effects of contaminants or pollutants on the water, the way that they seep into groundwater supplies, and the way that they're even if you spray in one area, right, those chemicals diffuse. They don't stay within a kind of concise or very kind of precisely defined location. And so I started thinking about how that same kind of theory could be applied to plants and animals. That once we move a plant or animal out of one context into another context, it doesn't stay there, right? You plant something in your garden, it goes to seed, or the rhizomes spread, or some birds eat the berries off of it and distribute the seeds. And so they have plants and animals and fungi and microbes. They all have the capacity or potential to spread beyond their initial site of transplantation or migration. And so, to me, that problematizes this idea of invasiveness, right? And the reason that we got interested in invasiveness is because invasiveness within the kind of ecological domain or even ecological field has become its own kind of separate field of study, basically invasive ecology. And it's widely discussed within the context of urban areas because urban areas, like where I was at, Cambridge, or even here in Philadelphia, are landscapes that are highly disturbed, right? People are constantly building new structures, tearing structures down, digging up sites, changing the landscape, changing the environment. And these invasive species, which are very opportunistic and very adaptable and very flexible, are oftentimes the first things to show up on these sites. And so this whole kind of invasive ecology conversation, the classification of invasiveness by USDA has led to some problematic ways that we deal with invasive or non-native species, right? We see them as a threat to our native ecosystems. We see them as putting pressure on our agricultural systems. And so that has warranted these very aggressive and widespread responses of using things like pesticides on the environment, or even other, sometimes less destructive methods, but still very very active methods, very disturbing methods of the landscape. And these pesticides often go downstream, contaminate waterways, they kill off aquatic species that are not a target. Even in the USA, still over 2 billion pounds per year our pesticides are applied to about 44% of the acreage of land in the continental United States. So about 40% of the area of the United States is regularly exposed to pesticide use, which is a staggering number to think about. And that 40%, by the way, corresponds directly to the amount of area of land which is allocated to agricultural use and farming. So all of these are issues that are interconnected and interwoven in really problematic ways. And it's impossible for us to think that all of these actions, all of these disturbances, all of these perturbances on the environment aren't somehow changing the environment and changing the ecology and causing certain species to adapt or causing certain diseases to show up within animal or human populations, right? And it also, again, problematizes our idea of like nature is one thing and culture is another thing when these culturally prescribed methods of dealing with the environment are subsequently changing nature, and then nature is changing us. So I like this quote from Bruno Latour, which I think kind of accurately describes what I'm thinking about here, which is, that all nature, all culture is a risky attachment, right? That all organisms influence or are influenced by one another through a process of intertwined feedback, right? The spraying of pesticides, the effect that has on both the target and non-target organisms, and then its subsequent health effect on waterways, everything downstream, and its effect on humans, right? So they're all interconnected in this process of feedback. And so it's fuzzy, it's entangled, and it really helps us to explode that dichotomy of nature and culture and try to see it in a different way. This is a video that I think, again, really accurately demonstrates this phenomenon of this feedback loop. So I'm sure you're all familiar with MRSA and MRSA and other drug-resistant bacterias. This was a study that was done at the Show Me Lab at Harvard Medical School on megaplate petri dish that shows how these bacteria evolve after being exposed over so many generations to increasing doses of antibiotics. So that's how much antibiotic is within each of the media on the plate. So the plate is inoculated, and you can see as the bacteria is growing, and you observe its morphology, that there are always these breakthroughs to the next generation, which are resistant to that increasing dosage of antibiotic, and then they proliferate. They hit that threshold of the next increasing dose. There are bacteria that adapts, break through. This process continues over and over again until you have something that is virtually completely resistant to whatever bacteria is being used or whatever antibiotic is being used to target that bacteria, which then, causes us in our studies to go back to the drawing board and try to develop new antibiotics, right? Which then we, again, this whole kind of process of feedback over and over and over again makes it really clear that human and natural systems are deeply intertwined with one another. So as I've been thinking about all of these issues and specifically how they relate to our food systems, I launched this collaborative project that's fortunately had the opportunity to move around and work in a couple different cities and a couple different contexts. Currently doing some work with a small group of students in Tennessee. Prior to that, I've been working in Boston as well as Cambridge. I've done some work in Linz, Austria with a research group there. But getting back to this point about, you know, how we manage our land for agricultural production, right? How that's implicated in the processes of environmental disturbance and climate change, and even what I'll get to here in a second about mass extinction and species die-off. It seemed like an opportunity to use food as a way to engage with communities on these issues, right? Which sometimes can seem like they're distanced from us, that they're not immediately affecting us, that they're global and they're not local. But food is this opportunity, in my experience, to invite people literally to the table to have a conversation through an approachable medium. So we actually started using food and collaborations with chefs and food producers as a way to start talking about and engaging with these issues. So the kind of subtext of the Future Food Project is that food is cause and consequence of climate change. And I mean that in a couple of different ways. One, the production of food has led to increased destruction of habitat worldwide, deforestation, and the removal of other kind of large carbon sinks. It's led to increased pollution and greenhouse gas emission, especially by meat production. Livestock production accounts for about 70% of all agricultural land use worldwide. It occupies about 30% of the planet's land surface, and it's responsible for about 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions, specifically methane and nitrous oxide. So that's just one example. That's just meat producers. And as we talked about, 40% of the arable land in the United States is allocated to agricultural activity. And then the flip side of that is that climate change is creating enormous problems and challenges for agricultural producers, right? It's causing drought, it's causing flooding, it's causing disease, the proliferation of pests like invasive species that I talked about before, which is then pushing farmers to be further reliant on engineered, intellectually protected monoculture crops, increased pesticide use, and further expanding agricultural activity into previously natural habitat, right? So there's this whole kind of feedback loop that's occurring there. Just some, graphics here. This is projections of the Amazon deforestation, red being what is currently been deforested by 2050, more than 50% is the projection by several different scientific sources, and majority of that is for cattle ranching and tree orchards. Similar things happening in Vietnam, again, mostly for agricultural activity. This is data from a recent study that looks at tropical deforestation. And then, this map again, farmland in the United States. So it's a pretty stark. If you live in the middle of the country, you live in pretty much corn, soybean, and wheat country. So we thought, well, how could we address these challenges of climate change in food systems through community engagement projects? One, that center on like local manifestations of these issues in connection to their global counterparts, and two, that start to embrace traditional knowledge of food waste, right, as a counterpoint to the engineered, industrial, and scientific. Not to say that that stuff's not valuable, but to bring the traditional knowledge back into dialogue, back into play. So this is one example project we did with Cambridge Public Library. We got a pretty well-known local ice cream maker, Gus Francatory, to make some ice cream with Japanese knotweed, which is a really prolific invasive species in the Massachusetts region. That seems to be the bane of every gardener and farmer that you talk to. But it has edible properties, and so we were able to use, again, food as a medium and as a platform to engage with specifically younger audiences in these conversations. And then we had them participate in educational activities while they were there. We did another project looking at the health of urban honeybees versus honeybees that are used to pollinate orchards and other kind of monocrop agricultural systems. We worked with the urban beekeeping laboratory in Boston Best Bees. We actually were able to, one, DNA test the honey to see specifically what pollen and nectar sources the bees were drawing from. Then we were able to do independent studies that looked at what kinds of diseases and other things affected urban bee populations versus rural bee populations. And we were able to put that all into the public space as a part of this honey tasting of urban procured honey. We've done a whole bunch of stuff with visualizations of this information, collaborations like this with David Gordon, where we took each of these kinds of themes of honey, of knotweed and invasiveness, and of food waste, and we had him imagine these kind of fantastical future visions for how these issues could be reimagined, again, through the lens of oftentimes traditional knowledge and traditional food waste, and also grassroots projects. So these were up in this exhibition. We also had this refrigerator that we commissioned artists to do a series of rotating food-based exhibitions within, and then that was nested within this Untold Possibilities exhibition at the Cambridge Arts Council gallery space. Most recently, the Future Food Project has completed a year-long collaboration with our community partner, Easty Farm in Boston, Mass. And our work centered on community engagement with issues specifically affecting local food systems, from supply chain disruptions and economic crisis created by the COVID-19 pandemic, to dependency on international supply chains, and again, IP-controlled commodity crops. We created a number of projects throughout the year, which ultimately culminated in an exhibition, but each one of them was about getting people involved in local grassroots, community organized forms of farming and agriculture. We were able to do this 8-week-long series through Zoom, where we partnered with a local chef to look at how we could repurpose food that had kind of been lost within the supply chain or slipped through the cracks of the supply chain because of all the disruptions that were happening. We were able to actually use that food as part of a meal distribution program where we were distributing about 1,000 meals a week. Then we also did this online program. We saved all the food scraps from that to dye fabric to create this quilt of East Boston with 2 top stitching lines, one in red, which represents the future coastline of East Boston as a result of climate change, and the blue line, which shows the historical coastline of East Boston. And it was really interesting to note how similar the future projection was to the historic coastline after or previous to East Boston being filled in, backfilled for development. We also created this East Boston streetscape. So we interviewed, we did projects with about 100 students in K through 6 schools and youth programs in East Boston. We asked them what their vision for a future food system within East Boston was. And then we partnered with our illustrator, Jessica Bierkowski, to create this giant window vinyl mural that spanned across the entire front of the East Boston Public Library. So all of that leads up to what I'm doing now with my BioArtist in residency at Integral Molecular, and I'm not, this is my kind of current research and observations. I haven't actually started into a project yet, but one of the things that I'm interested in and I've observed through this preliminary research period is this interesting connection between agriculture and biotech research that both rely on active cultivation to produce results, right? And so cultivation, right, the preparation of a medium for the controlled growth of an organism, which in the case of agriculture might be tilling land for corn, soybean, and wheat. In the context of biotech, might be culturing cells in a specifically tailored cell culture media. And the idea is that you want to get something to flourish and to be able to extract some sort of resource from it, right? Have some sort of intended outcome. So whether that's for vaccine development or developing intellectual property, finding antibodies, this active cultivation and that kind of parallel between agriculture and biotech, but also the actual relationship between biotech and agriculture was really interesting. So in the biotech world, when you're actually developing antibodies and doing that research, you rely on agricultural specimens and animals like chickens, horses, cows, many other animals that are kind of involved in this process. And the relationships, the actual kind of financial relationships between agricultural farmers and biotech researchers is also something that I'm very interested in right now. And I'm in particular interested in how we can reimagine cultivation, not as something necessarily purely about resource extraction, but to go back to its original meaning, which is to care for, to respect, to tend, or to guard. And so there's a lot of emerging research right now within the biotechnology and kind of clinical studies world that is looking at alternatives to animals as test subjects. So currently I'm looking at how chickens are used extensively, but there's a lot of research emerging on how computer simulations can be used as alternative models, and how animal-derived tissues, which can actually be cultured in vitro, can be used instead of the whole animal themselves. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now, is I've been spending some time in the laboratory shadowing some of the scientists, looking at how they actually do this research, trying to better understand the relationship between the agricultural industry, biotechnology research, and the public policies that actually shape the landscape of clinical studies and clinical testing, which currently right now under the FDA, it is required that you have animal tests done before you can actually enter into preclinical and clinical trials on human subjects. And that's part of the ethical shift away from pre-1950s when people were able to test directly on human subjects before testing on something else to determine the safety and efficacy of it. So here's some examples of those alternative methods. This is one of the things that I'm kind of looking at, discussing with scientists. I'll leave you with that thought.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was a great presentation. I want to open it up for questions from the audience. Okay.
How often is the artificial meat
How is the artificial meat company interacting with this?
Sorry, I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
How many of you might?
Okay, I just was concerned about how is the artificial meat industry impacting what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's another thing I've been kind of tangentially interested in. You know, if you're talking about the companies like Beyond or Possible, you know, I think that there are a lot of promising and compelling things about what they're doing. On the other hand, you're just kind of replacing one monocrop for another. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of healthy skepticism around what the long-term impacts those industries will actually have.
Would that reduce the methane production?
Yes, I mean, it definitely does. And
So
so
that's the down effect. It just goes back.
right. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a healthy amount of skepticism because again, you know, they're large industries, they're highly consolidated, they're dependent on monocrop cultivation still, and certain kind of patterns of land use that are problematic.
So Keith, can you talk a little bit about what it's like working with scientists and like how your experience is at Integral?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate to work with scientists for a number of years now in different capacities. I think probably the most exciting thing about it is that generally speaking, they're very receptive to having a non-scientist in their midst asking strange questions that may kind of fall outside of their traditional ways of thinking about the work that they do. I'm also, I would say, in some respects, naive a lot of the times about the things that they do. And so I go in with as few preconceptions as possible about what it is that they do or how their work impacts the world. And I'm constantly learning new things through conversations with scientists, especially being able to be there and observe firsthand the processes and the techniques that they use is pretty eye-opening. It's one thing to read about something in an academic journal or in the news, and another thing entirely to sit with a domain expert and to be able to observe firsthand and hear firsthand accounts of what they do and how they came into their field of practice. So yeah, it's been quite enriching, I would say.
That's great, and I bet 3 months isn't quite long enough to grasp everything that they
It would
do.
be a lifetime pursuit, because many of them, yeah, they've been working in the field for decades. So I'm there for 3 months trying to glean as much as I possibly can from their work.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments for Keith? Another question? I'm just, like in the future, how do you think, just like how do you think in the future, art and climate change and what the science behind that, how does that like all fit together in my opinion? Or like how can
how can one benefit others that if you're in a creative?
Yeah, I mean, maybe one way to answer it is, it took me a while to come to this as an artist, but I've started to see my practice as one of advocacy, right? And being able to work either with underrepresented communities or to address issues that I think maybe sometimes get swept under the rug or which are often too complex for people to engage with on a kind of day-to-day basis. And whether it's creating an art installation or some sort of community engagement project or an exhibition, I see art as a way to unpack those issues and to make them accessible for people, albeit briefly sometimes, but also, with the Future Food Project, it's been an ongoing project for several years now that my collaborator Matthew always likes to say it has legs. And every time we work with a different community partner or different constituents, it oftentimes spins off into something else, and we can actually see that it has real impact, right? It's not just like, it's not purely speculative or hypothetical, but we can actually see the ways that it's impacting communities and impacting lives and inspiring people to get involved in these issues. So maybe I don't know if that totally answers the question. Yeah.
So I just found it interesting how in the beginning of the career you work a lot with traditional techniques and with farmers and with more traditional techniques, and now you're working in science lab, like cutting edge technology. So do you find more merit in working more grassroots than the lab or elsewhere?
I think they're both really interesting. I will always feel drawn towards community-based work just because that's just kind of my personality, and I like working with people. And I specifically like working with a wide range of people. But the benefits of working in the lab space with scientists, again, is to have an opportunity to take a deep dive into something that, again, I'm kind of a night and about, and to enrich my understanding of it, and then take that back into the world and share it with people in an engaging way. So I don't know what the exhibition that will mount from this work is going to be yet, but I do know that it will have some sort of interactive, potentially community-based elements to it, as a way, again, to take this knowledge, which is not necessarily hard to access, but it does exist in this very specialized place, in this very specialized domain, be able to take that back out into the world somehow. Because even in my community engagement work, a lot of times the collaborators that we're working with are ethnobotanists, they're climate scientists, they're chefs, right? So they're all people who have some sort of like specialized knowledge about something.